Hi everyone, thanks so much to Elliot and Albane for inviting me. I'm going to talk about Gerry's Pompeii, and it's very difficult to talk about without kind of being there, because it's so much about atmosphere and kind of how he left it. I'll talk about who he is in a minute, but I'm going to basically try and show you how I discovered it first, so that you can try and discover it together, and just to kind of get a sense of scale first. And then we're going to go in more detail and look at very specific parts of what he made to try and understand kind of more about what his intention was, how he made it, and a bit about conservation. So is it working?
We can minimize this.
Oh.
Yeah. I don't know. Whoops. Sorry.
So just to position us, we've just walked down Portobello Road, Goldbourne Road, past the market stalls, and then we've gone along the canal, and we might have spied something kind of unusual, but it's difficult to tell what that is yet. And you'd go over the bridge and you go down this terraced housing onto Hormead Road. And Hormead Road is quite a special road because you can't go through at the end via a car. So if you're walking down Hormead Road, you either live there or you know where you're going and you're local. So there is this kind of closed community, quite safe feeling being there, which I think is quite important for what happened on Hormead Road. So I was taken here in 2018 by my friend Rock Sanford, who's one of Gerry's neighbours, and he told me that I would be that I'd love Gerry and I'd love his work, but I had literally no idea what I was about to see. So it was very exciting, and I did not know when I came through this door that I would be going back there over and over again, like hundreds and hundreds of times, and showing more people like you what was going on inside. So as you can see, the door is red, and he's kind of signaled that there might be something a bit unusual going on, again with the red paint, which was actually going all the way around the interior of the outside wall. And then you go in and you met this shy, kind of modest Irishman. He was 82 when I met him. And he kind of showed you in, and he just immediately took me in through the kitchen. I didn't see any of the other rooms. But we were greeted by this amazing wallpaper, all different kinds of wallpaper, sometimes different kinds of wallpaper in different rooms. So actually you can see above the door frame here, there's one wallpaper and then another next to it. This kind of layering is quite consistent with what Gerry made. And all of the walls, kind of like a salon hang in an exhibition, were filled with paintings that he had printed out, coloured over, and then taken out little bits of text that he found particularly interesting. So here we have William Bentinck. For over 30 years, Bentinck was William's chief favourite and was showered with titles and gifts. He held many important offices in the service of the king, including groom of the stool. And Bentinck comes up later on, so I just wanted to show you him now so that you'll see kind of what Gerry did later on. So then you go through the kitchen, and this was his sink, and he was sort of obsessed with making everything very pristine. So this cleaning materials here are kind of interesting. Everything was spotless. He was very house proud. He used to clean all his neighbours' houses, all of the streets, all of their front houses, and he would send everyone postcards saying like, welcome, like to the smiling woman at number 12 and the kind man at number 24. So everyone knew Gerry as a kind of very good neighbour, but no one really knew what was inside his flat. Only a few people. And I think what's interesting in this image is there's this mirror above the sink, which kind of, if you think about Gerry washing up, he's kind of positioning himself in the lineup of the greats that he's decided should be there. And he did that a few times. He's also here on the left as a young man, and he's written in third person, Jared Dalton in 1966. And he's kind of hand coloured in the flowers and felt to pen his hair in black. We think this is at Kew Gardens. Yeah, and then there's another photo of him above the fridge there. And that's Gerry below the mirror. And he's looking out onto the right. So as you go through the kitchen and you go right, your world totally transforms and you shrink down and you kind of go into one of the models that we'll see later. So in terms of scale, it's just extraordinary how he plays with it. And then this is his back garden. So bearing in mind, this is just a small terraced house, first floor flat, bedroom, kitchen, back room, garden. And this is where the kind of scale just gets like very extraordinary and quite overwhelming. And all of these, again, are models of military heroes, members of the royal family, Napoleon, who was a bit smaller than all the others, Louis XIV. You can kind of see he's got like the most gems on him. And Gerry said, Louis XIV, he was the guy that built Versailles, wasn't he? Amazing place. And it's almost like he's built Versailles because, okay, so there's a few details that are just amazing. So he picks out things that are particularly interesting. So Emperor Nero, he burned Rome, full stop. That's all you need to know about Emperor Nero. And in fact, all the emperors are lined up and on the right-hand side, and they've got these kind of special hair clips that demarcate them as Roman emperors. And then when you later realize that he filled his entire social housing flat, but that wasn't enough for Gerry. And so he broke through the wall and built some steps, but much later on, before he used a ladder to climb down. This is a recent building of steps. Before it was just covered, and he would use a ladder and climb down into his neighbour's garden, Nick and Alison, that very generously said, you know what, Gerry, we've got young children. We don't need all of this canal bank. Why don't you clear it and have your garden? So he cleared the whole canal bank, and over 30 years, in secret at night, hidden behind a row of hedges, he built this. So this is the view across the canal. So you can kind of understand that something's going on, but you have absolutely no idea until you're close. But this is it, slightly closer up. So as I said earlier about the Golborne Road, a lot of these objects he would gather from the Golborne Road, tiles that had been thrown out, disposed of. A lot of the tiles were given to him by neighbours that they would just sort of walk along and be like, oh, I gave Gerry that after I came out from Greece. Now it's on the wall. So people kind of did know about this part, but not the inside of his house. And again, military heroes, members of the royal family. So this is Gerry on the right. And this is an archive image from Nick Hall, his neighbour who lent him the garden. And so it used to be, well, totally grey. So he's added the gems and he's added the black and white and the red eyes that we'll see later on. But as you can see, it was completely hidden before. So he did it all at night, all in secret. No one saw him making anything. And then on the right, you can see a bit more that he's sort of started to sculpt the conifer trees. So you can start to peep through from across the canal. But still, he didn't cut down the trees until 4 years before he died, when we have all kind of assumed that maybe he thought he was finished to an extent, but finishing is a thing that we'll go back to. But it's sort of the big reveal where you could see much more than you could before. So then he took me back into his bedroom, than my first visit. And I couldn't believe that there was more to see. And this was his bedroom. You'll see that it was his bedroom because I'll show you a video clip in a minute. But I don't know if anyone can recognize this building here. Buckingham Palace. And then this is the Victoria Memorial in front. And then there's Sudeley Castle hidden under the chest, one of the only items of furniture. St. Paul's Cathedral on the left that was actually above a cupboard. His bed was there. I'm just going to show you this video clip now. I'm trying to... Oh, here we go. Okay. Sorry about the filming because it's my filming. It's terrible, but it's kind of one of the only things we've got.
like to bring the subject out.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
So it lives and breathes. Yeah.
Some pictures isn't all.
Yeah, exactly. They are.
You know what I mean?
This is bed.
You'll have a look inside.
Wow.
It opens up and all.
It's actually so exciting.
What? Oh my goodness, this is so amazing.
I wish it was a real one. Be nice to sleep in.
Yeah, probably.
I got that as
Yeah, so you can hear how excited I was. How do I? Yeah, so now I'm going to go into a bit more detail now that you've got an idea of sort of scale. Basically, he showed me all of this, and then he didn't show me one other room, and he said, "Can you come back?" And then I came back, and he said, "Oh, I haven't showed you the back room, have I?" And I was like, "What? There's another room." And then there was Hampton Court and Windsor Castle and everything else that he decided to put in there. But I just wanted to give you an idea of his voice. And it's also kind of interesting, I think, for architects to hear a bit about what he was thinking about. So his inspiration. I first got the idea of statues by going to museums. Buckingham Palace gave me the idea when I went to the Trooping of the Colour. But standing by the Victoria Memorial, that gave me the idea. Not just the memorial, but the palace as well. I decided to make a model of it. Had to search all over London for parts before I was finished. The architecture was difficult, the pillars and windows. I'd done the inside of it as well, made the old-fashioned beds and put up the pictures. I made Hampton Court Palace with a hammer and chisel and saw. That's all the tools I had. That took quite a while, worked into the night. There was no television in those days. I wasn't interested, had enough to get on with. I also did Windsor Castle. He starts off saying, not bad for a beginner. And by the time he gets to Windsor Castle, he says, I also did Windsor Castle. I managed to do the tower, but it's so big, it would take up my whole room. It even looks better than the real one, which it does. So this is Buckingham Palace again. I just wanted to show you like some of his thinking in that one of the neighbours actually that I showed around early on, who also lives in social housing opposite, she said, oh, you know, can you see that the Victoria Memorial Monument fits the exact square of one of the lino tiles? And we also found when the flat was cleared, all these markings where he'd clearly positioned things that he didn't want to move. And that's the kind of theme, you know, he didn't have a museum in his house. He lived in a museum. So all of the kind of normal accoutrements of normal life were kind of sidelined and just fitted in. So like his washing line was always in between these rows of statues. And this is Westminster Cathedral, which is over his sink. So he's built a special shelf. So you have to bend down to wash your hands. And this is one of the tomb vaults. He was obsessed with tombs. He spent a lot of time in Kensal Green Cemetery. And it doesn't feel somber, but it feels very much like he's interested in memorializing people. So a lot of the time he talks about people, it's about how they died and how they were heroic. And so yeah, if you open up the lid of Westminster Abbey, not only is there a chapel with like different kinds of materials so that it looks like stained glass, but there's also like rows and rows of tombs. And each tomb has a person, like, you know, who was the person and why they were interesting. And there's also the Last Supper over the loo, which I find particularly funny. And this is one of his reference books. So he this is a manual about Westminster Abbey. He's clearly been mining for useful information, and he's just cut out a bit from the book and he circles things with red. This is back to the wall. So I guess when you're looking at it, you might think that it could be sort of random, but actually the way he's positioned all the tiles is so kind of thought through. So and a kind of indication of this is that there's a square here, which is clearly where he's decided there needs to be a tile. And his friend Isaac, who looked after him basically as a voluntary carer for the last 4 years of his life, he would take him tile shopping, and he would go into a shop and he'd be like, I need this color, this tile, this height. And if he didn't have the right tile, he'd just leave the shop. So And then I guess he got more and more confident. He signed the wall in the Millennium, which I like. And he also signed some of the buildings. So here inside Buckingham Palace, you can see Buckingham Palace built by Gerard Dalton, year 1978 to 1984. So it took him quite a while building Buckingham Palace. And again, he signed this 2018 one, Goddess, signed at Gerry. And this is one of the oldest statues, Fruit Picker, Roman, 64 AD. And these are some more sort of, what's interesting is the juxtaposition between sort of non-hierarchical structure of the building. So we've got flats and we've got Scion House and we've got Buckingham Palace. They're all in the same room, you know, equally as important for Gerry. And this is Office Tower, which I think is pretty epic. And he was actually living there whilst Trellick Tower, which you can see in the background, was being built. Yeah. And then here we've got, so the only evidence of making were his paint pots that we found under the bottom of the stairs. And they again show his humor. So we've got for eyes only, which you can see he used for eyes only. In fact, it looks a bit like he's used it for the hair here, so maybe not just for eyes only, but mostly eyes only. And then we've got Shamrock Green. So I haven't mentioned anything about his biography because I think it's kind of interesting just to try and understand him from his work. But he was Irish and he left Ireland in the late 1950s, early 50s for a new life in England. And there are quite a few Irish figures, but very much not, you know, it's a real mix of Irish, British, European, anyone that sort of interested him. But Shamrock Green is a very kind of signifying label that he used. So we turned over the pictures and on the back of nearly every picture, he had painted this deliberate Shamrock Green. Some of the Irish immigrants that I've spoken to said that quite often there would be this kind of outward expression of fitting into British society and like this kind of interest in the royal family, but there'd be also maybe this kind of negation and like Irishness hidden. So like I feel that this Irish colour is, and it was in all the furniture he painted out Shamrock Green, and even the side of this piping in the room, he's painted Shamrock Green. And one of his mottos was leave a little sparkle wherever you go. Which is like hung up in the wall in the garden, and in the light it's just amazing, and at night if you go with a torch it's amazing. And then just to finish, so as we saw earlier, I showed you the image of William Bentinck. So this is an archive photo from the wall of the same label and the same guy that he's clearly moved from wall to Hall of Fame. But now he's when he got bored of someone or he thought someone was more interesting, he would just concrete over the wall and rename the statue. So this same position, you can tell because it's the same guy up here, but it's now Prince George of Denmark because he's more interesting than William Bentinck, has been relegated. And this idea of like remaking, refashioning, it's kind of a consistent work for Gerry. Like he never stopped. He always put more on the wall, change things, tweak things. And so this is kind of the problem that we have now, or the excitement that we have now, which is, you know, how we can conserve something in the spirit of Gerry when he's no longer with us. You know, do we just preserve it as it is and let it become ruined? Or do we kind of remake, reimagine as imagining Gerry would be there weeding and pruning and like a gardener that he was. And they're just finishing with this quote, which is the reason why we all refer to it as Gerry's Pompeii, and it kind of gives an insight into the, you know, how kind of sure Gerry might have been by the end. They'll be astonished what they'll find in my garden in years to come. It will be like Pompeii or something, Gerry's Pompeii. Yeah, thank you for listening.
It's so exciting to be presenting Van Gogh House next to you, actually, because there's so many similarities and references that we can kind of share as well. So I'm Livia Wang. I'm creative director of Van Gogh House, which is a terraced house in South London. Seems a bit bigger than Gerry's house, actually. It's like a 3-story house with 2 rooms on the ground floor, a bathroom, bedroom on the middle floor, and then 2 bedrooms on the top floor. And there's a kitchen and a garden. And as you might have guessed from the name, Van Gogh lived there. So Vincent van Gogh turned up in London, age 20, training to be an art dealer. And this is a photo of him age 19. So you can see what he basically looked like when he arrived in London. This is the house in a drawing that was once accredited to Van Gogh. You can see there's a big red arrow pointing at what our house looks like. But in fact, the picture was de-authenticated in 2012. But it's still, you know, an interesting image of what the house looked like in the late 19th century. And we can see there are 3 houses next to it on the right. This image actually is a sort of a cutting from a magazine that the previous custodian of the house kept. And you'll hear a bit more about her later. This is Van Gogh's room. Van Gogh wrote a lot when he was in London. So he wrote huge amounts of, sort of descriptions of landscapes, of nature, of his walk to work, about gardening, but also about his room. And I love the quote about his room. He says, "I'm so happy I finally have found a room without a sloping ceiling and without blue wallpaper with a green border." So you get the sense he was sort of different from Gerry in the sense he really likes sort of plainness and emptiness, no green borders, no shamrock green. But the room, this is how it looks now, because the house has sort of lots of different purposes. So we use it as an exhibition space. We use it as a space where people still live. So someone living in the house is actually with us today in the audience. But when Van Gogh lived here, it wouldn't have had a huge king-size bed. It would have had a single bed. It would have had a writing desk, a washstand, bookshelf, and somewhere to hang his clothes. He wrote vociferously. So this letter is him talking about his walk to work. There are lilacs and laburnums blossoming in the streets when he's walking all the way to Covent Garden. And something that's really struck me recently was that Van Gogh, he was living at a point where London was growing vastly and London was really sort of becoming itself. Huge amounts of construction. The 1870s is kind of when London street form kind of came into itself. And yet what Van Gogh writes most about is trees and parks and nature. You get a sense, because this map was published, I think, in 1876, and Van Gogh arrived in London in 1873. So you kind of get a sense of what activities he was doing. He writes about going to Dulwich Picture Gallery, the Royal Academy Summer Exhibition, the British Museum. He signs the guest books of all of these places as well. So he's very much a kind of modern Londoner who we can relate to and retrace the steps of. He writes home talking about how he wants a top hat. So sort of 18, 19, 20-year-old Van Gogh is someone who really wants to fit in. And a big part of the story that we tell is this kind of coming of age story. So what does it mean to move to London, to a new city at such a formative time when you're kind of in this brink between adolescence and adulthood? And it was really in London that he kind of began lots of cultural interests of his that would later on be seen in his work. He loved reading, so he read loads of Shakespeare, of Dickens, of the Brontes. A lot of literature at this time and art was sort of focused on a type of realism that hadn't been seen before. So realism in nature, but also realism in terms of city life. London at that point was suddenly had like 40% of people hadn't been born in London were living there. So the number of migrants in London at that time had like totally changed as well. And that led to kind of a different way of living. So people were living in much more densely populated houses and much more densely populated streets. But there was also the development of news and printing as well. And Van Gogh loved the cartoons that were published in newspapers that really depicted this kind of modern life that London offered. From, big contrast in the poverty of people who lived in the rookeries and slums versus, people gambling at races and going to balls. Once he left London, he remembered it very fondly. So you can see in the top left corner of this letter, which he writes from Paris, he draws a sketch of a view of Westminster Bridge as well. So the kind of imagery of both print in London, but also what London looked like was something that he kind of held in his head and recreated through writing and through his work later on. And something we'll touch on lightly, but not going to talk about in this talk is, the sort of motif of the empty chair, which came from Dickens, but also various other sort of influences too. Quickly, you can see this is where the house was located, in South London, just south of Oval. When the house was first built 200 years ago, so 50 years before Van Gogh even got into the building, it was on St Anne's New Road, and it was part of a terrace and a kind of not fully formed street. It was surrounded by market gardens, so people would be growing fruit and vegetables and then selling it in Covent Garden. And that was a really profitable way to kind of run land at that point. But in the 1870s, so 50 years later, suddenly London was far more populated. And I did this the other day. We were talking about how this is exactly the same scale. So you can see Brixton Road on the right there, and then the top of Clapham Road here. And those roads are exactly the same places, exactly the same scale. So within 50 years, London expanded at this really, really alarming rate. And you have to understand that Van Gogh entered London in this context as well. And so something that's very interesting to us is talking about Van Gogh not as this sort of singular person and what his experiences were, but also setting those experiences within a much wider kind of context of what was just happening culturally and kind of physically in the urban fabric at that time. So that's the kind of very brief overview of the Van Gogh story. The house actually came into my family's hands in 2012. It was sold at auction by the Smith family. Mrs. Smith had lived in Van Gogh House from 1950, where it was just known as 87 Hackford Road, through the 1970s, where it became known that Van Gogh lived in the house, till 2010. So she lived in the house for 60 years. For the first half of that time, it was also social housing, and then she bought the house on the right to buy. And this is just a nice way to meet her as well through this little video clip.
No one knew where Vincent lived in London until 1971, when a postman, a Van Gogh obsessive called Paul Chalcroft, tracked him down to this house. There's a Mrs. Smith living here now, and I imagine it was a heck of a surprise when the striking postman knocked on her door and told her that Van Gogh lived here. You must be Mrs. Smith.
Hello, good morning.
Do you know,
yes, I am.
I've read so much about you.
Really?
And about this house.
You're welcome.
Thank you. I really want to ask you, right?
Come through.
What was it like when the postman turned up, the striking postman?
Paul Chalcroft.
Paul
It was
Chalcroft.
very exciting, actually.
Is that one of his?
That's Van Gogh, and that's Paul Chalcroft too.
I mean, he was obsessed with Vincent, wasn't he?
Absolutely knew everything about Vincent from the day he was born to the day he went. In fact, his wife said to me, I don't know where to put all these pictures drawing of Van Gogh, she's driving me balmy.
Kind of get the feeling that if Mrs. Smith hadn't kind of been ambushed on the side with this whole Van Gogh story, that she might have been a bit of a Gerry herself. And sort of she had the opportunity to create her kind of own interior landscape. From those images, you can tell just how vivid an interior she was living in. But then Paul Chalcroft, who was this avid Van Gogh fan and who was on strike in the summer of 1971, he kind of cannoned in with all of his Van Gogh paintings, this story that he discovered through going to the local censuses and spending time, researching where Van Gogh actually lived. Interestingly, in the mid sort of 30 years on, we now know that the Van Gogh Museum always knew that Van Gogh lived in that house, but they just never really thought it was important enough. So it's a sort of interesting, development in how interested people have become in Van Gogh's life. So this is Paul, and now we start building up the kind of roster of characters that Van Gogh House is actually interested in. Obviously, we have Vincent van Gogh, but then we've got Marjorie Smith, and we've got Paul Chalcroft. All of these people who have left like a very intense mark on the building. A lot of the things we have on display in the house actually come from Marjorie Smith's archive. So that sort of initial magazine cutout of the drawing that Van Gogh might have done of the house to this photograph of the great-granddaughters of Van Gogh's landlady. This has obviously been something that other artists have been interested in. So kind of at this stage of the project, Saskia Olde-Wolbers, a filmmaker, was invited to make something for the house commissioned by an arts production company called Art Angel. And this is just a clip from the film she made.
One evening, Mr. Brown heard something in his sleep. He went down and saw someone peering through the curtains in the front room. "Good evening, Mr. Brown. I am Dr. Van Gogh." He spoke through the glass. "I am sorry to hear my late uncle is causing you trouble." He hesitated, then continued, "Mr. Brown, I would have liked to have been the bearer of more positive news, but after careful consideration, with updated techniques, Dr. Deville at our institute has concluded that the drawing is not by Vincent's hand. There are people making a lot of money with forgeries, and we are in the clutch of all sorts of scandals." The doctor's deep eyes peered intently through my net curtains, perhaps hoping to see if these were the exact windows that had framed his uncle's uncertain gaze. A few days later, Mr. Brown was woken again, this time by a Dr. Brenner from Holland, who had taken position behind my letterbox.
Art is not
Art
science.
is not science. It cannot be reduced to the paint samples in Professor Deville's test tubes. If a work of art enables you to feel the emotion intended by Vincent, it can only be his. I can authenticate the drawing in exchange for a small fee. But Dr. Van Gogh's news about the drawing had already reached the council, and a compulsory purchase order was issued to the Browns and their neighbours. Demolition began promptly, to my left.
You can look this up online as well. But Saskia made this really amazing film that treaded the line between what was true, what was myth, both in terms of Van Gogh's story in the house, but also the sort of the future of the house as well. So this house wasn't actually slated for demolition, but its neighbouring houses were, and that's why the area became a conservation area. So instead, she imagines, it turning out that Van Gogh didn't actually ever live here in the first place, and that's why it was going to be demolished. Interestingly, Van Gogh's landlady was called Madame Loyer, which actually means rent. Apparently, I don't speak any French, and so apparently they sort of made the argument that he was just writing this letters like, "Oh, Mrs. Rent was landlady." So at that point, the house was looking like this. So Mrs. Smith was 100 when she moved out, and her children moved her out. But obviously, she wasn't kind of in the state to look after the house properly. The three houses to the right of this, which was shown in the sketch, were bombed during the Blitz. So the house actually has this kind of post-war story to it as well. And the repairs made to it were sort of very kind of mid-century sort of their time. So loads of concrete was used, water got in because the concrete really damaged really soft brick. Loads of concrete render was used to repair the house as well, concrete roof tiles. So then there became this process of slowly peeling back the layers, taking away all the plastic that was in the house, the multiple layers of lino and kind of plastic fruit that Mrs. Smith had left up, kind of getting rid of all the ivy that was taking over the kitchen and growing in, and then doing something sort of very sensible with it, as an architect does, and just using really careful materials to conserve it. And we really treated the building as this object that needed conservation and not restoration. So we weren't trying to bring it back to any kind of point in time. We just wanted to make it into like a healthy building that could still exist for a long period of time afterwards. And a big motivation of that as well was to be able to still give it a purpose. So at first, this project was done as a student project where I was just trying to understand how we might approach this. And I did a huge amount of photogrammetry of just scanning the building and trying to cast the building and trying to understand what was already there. In a way, that was a bit of an exorcism because you felt like you couldn't really do anything or change it unless you documented it in as many ways as possible. So documented a lot through photographs like this, also photogrammetry, but also taking lots of casts of the building as well. So the fireplaces, the textured wallpaper that Mrs. Smith had used everywhere, casts of the floorboards and things like that. And after a year of doing that, finally, it felt okay to start actually lifting up the floorboards and excavating the building and looking for kind of clues that were within the cavity of the building rather than just documenting the surface, because that's what I sort of realized I was doing after about a year. So when the builders actually came in, we began to find this whole other layer of stories, people who lived in the house before Van Gogh's time. So we had these kind of new characters coming in, namely James Wigmore. So I don't know if you can tell here in the bottom right-hand corner, James Wigmore. He was a little boy. He was the eldest out of 7 sons who lived with his family in the house in the 1850s and 60s. And we found his just little stash of toys and handwriting and objects that he collected under the floorboards in Van Gogh's bedroom. And we just loved the idea that by the time Van Gogh got there was already layers and layers of history and things for him to kind of excavate. So the paper on the left is James writing carefully attend. And because he signed and dated everything, as you do when you're practicing your handwriting, we know this is from 1858 when he was aged 11. And then on the right, we have embrace every opportunity of acquiring knowledge. And then him practicing his ABCs on the right. And that he was 13 when he was doing that. And so suddenly I've got this kind of like ancestry.com account. We're trying to just do the family trees of the Smith family, of the lawyer family, of the Wigmore family, and all of the other people that come up in the censuses in between. Something else we found actually was this little hymn book, as well as those of house insurance documents that we believe belong to Mrs. Smith, and that, not Mrs. Smith, Mrs. Loyer, Van Gogh's landlady, and that became a way to actually prove that she lived there and that there was a relationship between her and Van Gogh. So after the conservation, you can see the kind of before and after of the outside of the building. We really understood that the kind of facade of the building had this kind of public monument kind of function to it, because neighboring areas had, like the school opposite being renamed Van Gogh Primary School, a neighboring road had been pedestrianized and called Van Gogh Walk. There were artist studios that were open called Vincent's Yard. So there was this real need for the blue plaque to be something that sort of members of the community could access and sort of draw narratives from. So it really benefited like a wider group of people. And then the interior of the house, because Van Gogh had sort of said what it wasn't, we could kind of do what we wanted with it. I really wanted there to be color in the way that Mrs. Smith kind of encouraged, but there also needed to be a sense that the building could display artwork. It could also tell its own stories. So you would be able to kind of read different, all these different characters and different textures and different times within the fabric of the building. But you could also allow people to live there now. And so what we do is we host artist residencies, but we also commission new artworks within the building. And it's something that there's kind of a lot of tension within, because obviously you want these buildings to carry on living and changing, but it's also actually very difficult to allow this to take place, sort of, you know, for someone to feel comfortable to make a change to the building, or to sort of pick which stories you highlight. So here we've got the toilet. It's not the exact toilet that was in the house when Van Gogh was there. We still have that, but it's just not usable. But it's actually an object that tells lots of interesting stories. So Lambeth was this point where a place in London where lots of sanitary ware was made, and we found a Lambeth Royal Bolton, found a toilet seat where the guy on eBay said it came from Reading Jail, which is where Oscar Wilde was kept. So, you know, the story is now that the toilet's this place that has all of these news stories that we've kind of invented and added to the building. Whereas the staircase is somewhere where we just sort of left exposed and people kind of just get an overall sense of time and materiality. And these are the builders and craftspeople who worked on the building very carefully. And then this, we began to start inviting artists to make kind of material changes to the house as well. So this is a pigment timeline by Jo Volley, who teaches at the Slade, and a lot of her work is around colour and sort of trying to understand colour through these graphic drawings she makes. So on the far left here, you've got all the kind of Paleolithic or prehistoric colours. So things that come from earth and charcoal. And then you have the ancient colours of the Greek, Roman, Assyrian, things like indigo. And then on the far right, this is the medieval. I think we've got madder. And then 17th century, 18th century, and then 19th century when you get the sunburst and synthetic pigments. And that's something that's painted directly on the wall. And therefore, you know, this sort of idea of the history of colour and time is now just part of the building and not sort of a collection that might change. This is a spindle that was carved into the stair. We invited an artist called Oliver Dorman to fill in a missing gap because there was a missing piece of the staircase. And we had lots of different proposals for this, lots involving paintbrushes and sort of sunflowers intertwining, and Oliver's was a really beautiful piece because it was actually a bit more about the space. So he put the twist in it and he said, you know, it's at the point where the staircase turns. And so it's really nice to have the turn in the banister there where people can sort of run their hand up and down it. We also commissioned artists who were doing a residency to make curtains in the house. As part of that, they were using lots of the plants that Van Gogh writes about in his letters in the local area to make curtains. And as part of that, they did a lot of teaching to local groups too. And this is the view from the garden looking at the back of the house. And you can see how actually the neighbouring houses are exactly the same. The one on the right is actually still owned by a housing association, and the one next to that is a private home. And so these houses, they've all been lived in by so many different types of people and in different ways as well. This house often had probably about 10 people living in it, and now it's become this place where artists come and live in for a month at a time, whereas the one on the right is still flats, and the one next to it is lived in by an older woman. I'll go through this part really quickly, but now we run a public program where we invite artists to do shows. Saskia actually came back to the house and showed a lot of the models that she made for her films in the house, and we screened the film as well. This is Kate Bright, a painter who brought show work in the house, reflecting a lot on nature, a big theme that we're interested in. And then we also had Brian Griffiths and Frank Kent, who sort of did a photography project in the house. And we really like this sort of Van Gogh reading in bed, a book about himself with all the other books about himself on the bookshelf. Brian and Frank actually brought more characters into the house. So Bob Law was a minimalist artist in the 1980s who made drawings, mainly known for his minimalist drawings, but he also made a Gauguin chair and a Vincent chair. And then Brian and Frank actually ended up photographing these chairs within their own scenographies. And so now the chairs have also been reinterpreted a few times and had sort of different people attached to them as well. We run volunteer guided tours, and every volunteer, when they take people around the house, tells like a totally different story as well. And people bring a lot of their own stories to these tours. So people love talking about their own DIY experiences or their own kind of family archiving experiences as well. I think that's what's really nice probably about sort of Van Gogh House, about Gerry's Pompeii. They really talk of this time and of sort of really familiar, grandfather figures, or makes you think of your own family home renovations. We also do this for children, and it's very funny to sort of see what they're interested in. They're not so interested in Van Gogh, but they really love the under the floorboard thing and the time capsule idea. Teachers in the house, musicians writing music for the house. I guess the more we do it, the more I realize the structures and sort of timeframes and way people frame projects is really important in kind of collaborations with outside groups as well, and sort of working out how someone might contribute to the building, because, you know, AA summer school is something that happens in the summer, or, you know, everyone's got their own way to sort of carry out projects. And so now our kind of wild dwellers, I suppose, the way to allow more stories to be added to the house and for it not to be overwhelmed, there's kind of a lot in that programming and trying to work out how you invite people, how you fund things, how you kind of program stuff throughout the year. Yeah, and this is just a diagram I did ages ago that I found recently that I thought was interesting. It was like me trying to make sense of all the different times and the different stories. And obviously there's now, you know, loads more to add on, the different artists who lived in the house and different contributions other people have made. And coming up next September is the 150th anniversary of Van Gogh arriving in London. So sort of trying to work out what that will be. Because a lot of the sort of commissions and projects we've done with artists so far haven't really actually been Van Gogh related. And maybe next year is a chance to do that. Yeah. Thank you. I think there should be, so don't what you want in the background.
There's a time for questions and hopefully conversations. We started a bit late, so there's a bit more time anyway. Maybe we thought we'd start with one question for each one of you, and then start a conversation from this. So maybe maybe for Livia first. You just finished. You were trained as an architect, and you also developed this kind of fictional relationship, or I guess in part fiction relationship with Van Gogh. And I just wondered how your training as an architect has influenced the way you approach this project that you've been working on for like a few years.
I sort of think in a way the beginning really felt like being an architect. So it really felt about like making sure you did all the research before you started the project and like being like, okay, I've done this all now. And then once we got planning permission, I suddenly realized there was just like so much stuff that the sort of actual like RIBA process didn't allow for. So none of the Mrs. Smith stuff was kind of included in the planning permission part. It was all about writing a really good narrative. And that's something that's sort of really important within funding applications as well, being able to write a really, really good narrative and convince someone why this piece of heritage is important. And I think that came sort of really easily after doing architecture projects where you have to present over and over and think of a good story and why you're doing something, what your motivations are. But then it kind of didn't allow for like all of the weird messiness. And it didn't actually allow for sort of proper analytical art historical research either. And that's something that I've kind of had to do a lot of catching up with. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that's important for architect students to hear that. Yeah, that's often you don't get, yeah. Architecture doesn't have everything, right? And so for you, Sasha, we have also a bit of a similar question, which is like you are a curator, you're also a campaigner, possibly. You have to tell us how you define yourself. And you've also been with Gerry. So you have this proximity, maybe these emotions and all of this that you want, I guess, to share. And so our question, I guess, is how are you thinking about this relationship that you were a witness close to Gerry when you are trying to share and how this is going to inform your project, how it's going to change, because it's another approach.
Yeah, that's a really good question. It was really, at the beginning, it was kind of, I basically asked his family to give me the keys to the flat when he died, because I was like, initially we thought we could just move it because we didn't think we could preserve it in social housing. And so I basically realized at the funeral how many different kinds of people were invested in Gerry as a person, because he had friends from all different ages, social backgrounds, even just on the street. There's like an amazing cross-section of London, and everyone just had this very close relationship with him, and not even to his work, just to him. And so I was really conscious early on of like making sure that that they all felt that sharing his work was the right thing to do. And also in a residential neighborhood, that we had two of the neighbors upstairs, and you know, they had to be comfortable with us coming in and out with like all these random people all the time. So, but in terms of going forward, I guess I kind of kept thinking of how he told Rock and I to kind of keep the garden, and also because he defined himself as a gardener. It's interesting that you said Van Gogh was obsessed with kind of gardens and the trees when he was in London, because Gerry was obsessed with defining himself as a gardener, which I think ultimately gave him more freedom to do what he wanted, like more license in a way than if he called himself an artist, because I think he thought an artist was more like Van Dyck or the people that made the paintings in the palaces that he was making, rather than he himself. This is so then what was my train of thought? It's kind of gone. But yeah, I guess the bravado and the showmanship of Gerry showing me initially, and how he saw, like when he got so excited by someone's reaction of being kind of like, I cried, and he said, you're a bit overwhelmed, aren't you? And I was like, are you joking? And that's basically what everyone's reaction was when I showed them as well. So I guess the reassurance of sharing someone's legacy that's no longer around, and the kind of difficulties around whether that feels good or not, especially because the private public thing was very much Gerry. Like, he had a public face and the wall was public, which kind of makes me think that he wanted it to be shown, but then he didn't show that many people inside. So then, but yeah, so I guess those are things to think about. But the spirit of Gerry is how I'm thinking about how to continue it, rather than a kind of blow by blow conservation technique. Yeah.
We have another question basically for both of you as well, and then we will open for everyone to have a chat. And also if there is anyone who has a question on the chat. And then you've already started to do it in a way which is to react to each other's project. And so I think that the next question we wanted to ask you is, because there are so many similarities, but they are so different. I mean, one is maybe more of a fiction, but you found so many things, and the other one, like, you're trying to keep, and you're campaigning for something that is difficult to keep as well. So yeah, would you like each other to react to the other?
Yeah, I guess the kind of layers of story is really interesting for me. The kind of how you've chosen to kind of dissect a place and like place making, and I wish we still had the flat to do that with. I was like thinking, God, it'd be so good to then peel back the layers as well. But I guess the monument idea I found really interesting between these two projects. Kind of how do we memorialize? What do we memorialize? What's kind of relevant to certain people? And then, as you were talking about kind of different people picking up on different things, I had the same experience with Gerry's kind of each person that came round. I think because he wasn't famous and no one knew about his history, which is different from Van Gogh, but like this kind of visceral feeling that you get from basically walking around someone's imagination, which is what Gerry's is. Like, everyone brought their own history to it. So if they're a historian, they say, oh, clearly Gerry's really interested in personalities rather than like historical allegiances, or I don't know, yeah, someone that lived in similar social housing would pick up on the different bits of furnishing that was similar, or Irish people picking up on the shamrock green. But I don't know, like, maybe interesting to hear more about the kind of making a monument something that hasn't been monumentalized, or this like tension between Van Gogh as a famous person, but then his kind of less famous life in London. I don't know.
Yeah, it's definitely something around people like really loving connecting personal stories to things. And I guess when you're in such an intimate space and talking to someone, that's why I think the sort of setup or of a guided tour is actually really great, because when you have exhibitions, people sort of tend not to be so chatty, or they kind of feel like they need to know who they're talking to. But when you have these sort of set up these like slightly performative situations where you actively say like, oh, now there's time, do you have any questions to ask me? That's when you get really, really good sort of stories back, and you start getting it from just like members of the public and not people that you've invited. And I think that gets like really exciting.
And then the dynamic between the people I find really, like, we had, the director of the Serpentine, someone from social housing, someone from the road, a curator, and us, like, all together sharing equally as kind of relevant relationships to Gerry's work. And I think that's,
well, I guess like doing it in a house is like really different to doing it like this. Like you were saying, like, oh, you had to like really talk us through the building and the approach and things like that. And when you actually just go through that experience with people, then it really breaks down sort of hierarchies, like in the way that Gerry's just placing stuff on the floor really allows to happen. Yeah, I do find that the sort of monumental side of it, or the fact that people had like real attachments to the front of the house and the blue plaque, was actually really intimidating at first, because when you're doing projects like this, it feels very intimate and you're sort of not sure if you're doing it right, so you're quite reticent to share it with people. It's really taken kind of, I don't know, the 8 years to be able to get over that and to be able to share it. It's sort of really weird. And yeah.
The kind of pressure of legacy is quite, yeah.
And also just so many people have sort of ideas of what it should be or it could be, or they don't actually, but when you're doing the kind of work, you sort of worry about it, I suppose. Yeah. But what happens with the house as well? Sorry. You say you don't have it anymore with the flat.
Yeah, it's a long story, but yeah, we've got the wall, and so we're gonna turn it into a kind of, well, we're gonna hopefully provide access by a canal boat, and then kind of, I really want to start a residency program on a boat, so I'd like to talk to you more about this. But yeah, kind of responding to Gerry in the spirit of Gerry, but it'll have to be in a different kind of placemaking thing. But in terms of like the community part, the community with Gerry's was literally the most important thing, and still is, in terms of it kind of brought the whole road had different relationships with Gerry, and then after death they realized that they were all friends with him. They all thought they had private relationships with him, but they actually were all really good friends with him. And so then we all sort of came together as I'm like a wannabe member of Formid Road, and sort of come together in his death. So it's interesting what someone's work can do to people that didn't know him, but also kind of community building around that. Yeah.
Maybe there needs to be these sort of big events like death to be able to sort of spearhead things to move. Or just sort of, like we're so, I don't know, you imagine everything to be sort of well thought through and timed and spaced out, but actually sometimes you need like massive deadlines or events or sort of huge moments of coming together to sort of propel things forward. It's like very uneven. It's not like a sort of general going up. It sort of goes through big steps and things. Yeah. Any questions?
Hey, I was thinking about kind of the emotional reactions that everybody seems to have when they come to the houses, and they're both situations where people react in quite an emotional way. I just wondered if you kind of have thought about kind of where that emotion, is it different for different people, or is it something about time and nostalgia or connections through time, or where that emotion kind of how it comes, because it's quite strong in both of pieces, isn't it?
I think something about the intimacy of a house, because like mostly everyone can relate to living in a house at some point in their lives. So I feel like it's a kind of, it's an understanding that we all have, and it's a kind of way of bridging all sorts of social economic boundaries that we might have, and the barriers that we definitely have going into like a site, like a museum or a site designated for art. And I think you can become really overcome by just trying to understand how someone dedicated their whole lives to something, and in a way that doesn't have a normal barrier to entry. And because anyone could be like, oh, but interesting how you've put that Westminster Abbey over the sink. My sink is more like, more minimal. Or I don't know, it just kind of, there isn't any assumptions, there isn't any over academic kind of thought process. It's very like visceral, immediate, instinctive reaction.
I really agree, and it also inspires me, like all the people I meet through doing it inspires me to just like share more. It's like, you're like, whoa, these people really enjoy like giving their personal anecdotes or really, really talking through sort of quite personal experiences in a way that maybe sort of gain confidence as you have more life experience and get older and things like that. But yeah, sort
it's
of
quite therapeutic sometimes, the tours, I think. The new form of therapy, the house museum.
Another question. Okay. Otherwise, I just had a question. I mean, there's like so many, just trying to bring it maybe also to architecture. There's so many things that are relevant to like architecture or architecture school and what architecture does. And then, what I find is like really amazing is like the relationship to a community that I think, and I remember Livia, you told the other day, or even today, that you discovered recently, like the impact it had on the neighborhood and people around. But that's one aspect that you talked about. But I had more questions actually about conservation and materials that are used in both these places that are maybe a bit more unusual with Gerry, because I guess it would be great if you could tell a bit more about, you said that we don't really know how he made things, and then how it can be repaired or preserved. So and what you were talking about, the attitude towards something that exists and whether it should be repaired or almost enhanced or continued, or something that needs to be preserved. And that these questions, I think, are really relevant to like architecture, cities. I mean, especially, well, London, but many cities. But maybe you can start with Gerry, because it's maybe more unusual, I guess, material fabric of the architecture.
Yeah, I mean, the conservation teams that have come around, so City and Guilds we were working quite closely with, they were like, oh my God, this is the most unusual combination of materials ever, like what's going on? And also in terms of how he made the kind of concrete models is actually really difficult. Like he had like a seasonal practice. So he sort of casually talks about making models, which I think is funny to talk about with architecture students who are like really like specifically making models, like really long process. Gerry like made models when he couldn't make the bigger works outside just to fill in the time. And so, yeah, I think he used a mold for the ones outside in the garden, which has disappeared. But like working into the concrete is actually really hard before it dries. And lots of people that work with concrete are like, how did he do that? And then there's a kind of rumor, there's lots of rumors and myths, like we're talking about myths, that he got sort of a lot of the statues outside on the wall from a job lot from his friend at a garden centre, and then he kind of like made them more Gerry, kind of pimped them. But yeah, he didn't use very good glue, so that's become really problematic. So we're just trying to work out like when to reattach things, how to get new things. Some of the wall is kind of like growing these crystals on. So we're like, do we need to make some kind of canopy that could be removed but put over in winter to kind of preserve the wall as much as possible? But also, I think Gerry would be really angry with the state of the weeding situation right now, and the hedges, like everything was, as I said, immaculate. So it's just not pristine, and he was so house proud. And so in that kind of sense, I think we should continue in his vein. So it's like very immaculate. But I think, yeah, kind of losing the flat, I think we have maybe even more room to kind of engage with a wider community, use a boat, go up and down, like bring more people in, those kinds of things.
It's really interesting thinking about just like, obviously that would just cost so much money to have someone weeding every day and keeping it as immaculate as Gerry did, because he just lived there, and that was just like how he lived his life, and that kind of intense living is really different from, that's like the big issue with sort of historic houses that you kind of want people to live in and everything, is that it's like really intense to live in them. Like Aisha has to do a lot of watering at the moment, constantly in the garden, sort of keep it up. And yeah, I don't know, it's very difficult when you take that into like an institutional or a kind of official setting to be able to keep that up in the same way.
Yeah, like level of care, like what does that mean? Quite interesting.
And also how you should document all of those stories as well, because obviously there's the documenting the materials and just seeing the way people make tables and photograph every single object, but then that's like this kind of context of each object and how you understand all the stories attached to it, as well as its kind of material context and all of that. I don't know how those are kind of drawn or surveyed in the same way, you know.
Layering of like the institutional and the domestic, I think is going on in both spaces. So if we don't find another space, we think it's completely separated. And he's living at Mango. Watering the it's a very important issue, because every time we leave the house, that's one of the things I want to do, is to jump out the gas. I'm so paranoid because it's still an institutional space, and it's a restored space, and it's and there, I mean, Livia kind of mentioned it, but the Tate had once done an exhibition where they had the books that Van Gogh read when he was here, and they've got first editions, I think, of the books, which is just in the bedroom. So I sleep next to the shelf of like first edition books, which is very valuable. It's just like, yeah, the institution and the domestic and the layering of the two is, yeah, what I want to comment on. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. You think there's a proper way to do everything, and then you realize actually everyone's making it up, and you have to like.
Yeah, exactly. No one knows what they're doing.
Yeah. Have to talk afterwards.
Maybe it's time. It's a good way to conclude anyway the talk. So thank you very much. Maybe, yeah. Can we?